For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Or welcome, if it's your first time. I am your host, Jade Black, and today I'm doing some literary analysis, which is something I've not really done in quite this way on this podcast before. So this episode stems from my first read of 2025 being a DNF, which is less than ideal, but it is what it is. I thought it would be an interesting exercise for me as both a writer and editor, honestly, to think about the problems of this book and how to fix it. I did also want to justify to myself DNFing the book because I was halfway through and I thought, well, should I just write it out at this point? But there was an amount of justifying, DNFing it, and then wanting to do more analysis to really think about quite why this book annoyed me so much, and how it could be made better, and what things should have been done differently without question. First and foremost, I will say, I am not going to tell you what this book is. This podcast episode is not about punching down on other people. That is not the point. The point is that it's analysis, we learn, we're interested in these. Sort of literary analysis, writing analysis, how to improve craft, different craft questions, different things you can look at to improve your own writing, or as an editor to improve other people's writing, or even as a beta reader. It's an interesting thought exercise as much as anything else. It's not about punching down on someone else. That's not the point. What I will tell you, though, is that it is a gothic horror, in inverted quotes. I don't think it should be called a horror, I really don't, but that's for later. And another thing I will say is that I did consume this as an audiobook. So there is every chance that the audiobook did not do this book justice. But I doubt that because the narrator was pretty good. Not the stellar best narrator you've ever heard, but certainly a skilled narrator, so. Food for thought on that one, a few little caveats as needed. So I'm going to head straight to the biggest problem with this book first. And yes, it's fashionable to hate prologues, but it is genuinely a terrible decision with this book. There should never have been a prologue in this book. And I want to say, first and foremost, this prologue is beautifully written, and it's super engaging, and it's probably the single best part of the book. But it ruined the first half, if not more, of it. Because the problem with the prologue is that it tells you way too much. It tells you the answer to the whole mystery subplot, stroke plot, of the book. There's a whole big thread about but what happened to this person, but in the prologue you're just straight up told. So there's no actual mystery experience reading it at all. And it's just annoying watching these people try and figure out this, honestly, not very complicated puzzle that you've been told the answer to. It's not entertaining. It's not fun. It's not well done. I just don't really understand why it's there. It certainly doesn't add anything. And I'll say, if you wanted to make the prologue into its own standalone piece of short stroke flash fiction, go for it. That's brilliant. Or include it as like a bonus chapter at the end, so you see what happened through someone else's eyes, yeah, that's great. But don't... having it as a prologue that just spoils the book is just the weirdest decision. It really is. I don't understand it at all. The other really big problem I have with this is the pacing. And I think having read this, that actually this wasn't originally a novel. I don't think this was a novel at all. I think this might have been a novelette. As in, this book is 300 pages as it stands. I think it was originally supposed to be 100 or fewer. And honestly, it was probably brilliant as a novelette. It was probably beautifully written, without the prologue, I would assume. And everything was probably done a lot in terms of plot and pacing. It was probably a whole lot better. Because as it stands, a subtotal of fuck all happens in the first half. You know, there are, I would say, 3 key events that happen in the first half. There's one that happens at the early, but then the other 2 don't happen until like 40-odd%. So you've just got an opening that's fairly pointless, and then a whole massive chunk in the early part that is also pointless. And it's just bloat. And there's just no real reason for it to be there. And I know this is partly me being a thriller writer and the sort of cut to bullet points, flesh out as needed, have your character moments, but, you know, keep it going, and Gothic fiction isn't that. Gothic fiction is slow by design, that's part of the point, but it takes the piss with slow by design. It really does. It's just, especially for a book that's really short, it's 300 pages, it's not long. If you're talking about an 800-page book, and nothing much really happens in the first 100 pages, 150, to an extent you can almost accept that, because you're like, well, okay, this is a massive book. It's slow, it's indulgent, blah blah blah. But if that's the halfway mark, if nothing's happened in the first half, that's difficult to swallow. And I would say, especially in something like horror isn't the quickest genre, but it's not slow. Because if it's too slow, it loses its effect. Which this book certainly does. But it's not just that it's bloat and it's slow, it's also that that bloat is done badly. It's done horrifically badly. And I know this is fashionable to hate on as well as flashbacks. I've never been the biggest fan of flashbacks, I will put that out there. But, you know, I can accept when they're done well, they can add a lot to story, especially if there's some non-linear storytelling in terms of time and all of that. That can be really interesting, that could be really cool. There's no non-linearism here, though. But the problem I have with a lot of the flashbacks is firstly that they're really, really long. As in, some of them are half a chapter, or equivalent narration time, that's 10 minutes. Which is, if you assume a page a minute, that's 10 pages of flashback. Just sort of thrown in the middle of a chapter, and that's quite difficult to swallow. But the flashbacks also don't really add anything, and I do mean that because they've already been alluded to. What happens with most of the flashbacks is that in internal dialogue, internal monologue, someone remembers something and remembers, you know, the key takeaways of it. Remembers how it made them feel, or this thing that happened, and then a few pages later, you get pages and pages of flashback of that memory. But you don't learn anything new in that flashback. You see the key moments happen, but the rest of it is completely and utterly pointless. There's literally no purpose to it being there. So it just doesn't add anything. And the worst part of it is that conversations are interrupted for flashbacks. And then you're supposed to go straight back to halfway through a conversation, and they're not short flashbacks. I mean, that's the odd one that is, but not most of them. You'll literally get halfway through a conversation that can almost be a bit tense, read 3 pages of flashback, and then go back to the middle of the conversation, and it's just the most bizarre decision to do that. I really don't understand that decision at all. I can't get my head around it. I can't begin to get my head around it. I'm not a fan of interrupting conversations for a paragraph of context or this or that anyway. I think that's poor writing, personally. I think that should be done before or after the conversation. Don't interrupt a conversation halfway through. It's just a weird thing to do. I don't like it. But especially if it's really long and a flashback, if it actually matters to the conversation, shocker, these ones don't, have a line of internal dialogue that cuts to the chase. Especially if it's a key or tense conversation, why are you interrupting that with pages of nonsense? You're killing your tension and impact completely. Why are you doing that? It doesn't make any sense. I think if this book had stylistically wanted to use lots of flashbacks, if that was just a stylistic choice that was going to be made, I'd almost do that as epigraphs. I feel like that would have worked a lot better if you sort of have these semi-epigraphal flashbacks. I would accept that as a stylistic choice, and yeah, I might not like it, and I might not think it adds anything, but it would at least be an interesting experimental sort of stylistic choice that gives some vibes, gives some feel, gives something. That I'm fine with. Or having flashbacks that have a purpose, where you're not just rehashing something that's already been done, which this book does a fucking lot. But also consider the length of these as well. Does anybody want to read 10 pages of flashback that doesn't add anything? That's a genuine question. Does anybody want to read that? Because I would be shocked. Those 3 points together, the prologue, the pacing, and the flashbacks, are ultimately what made me DNF this book. I just couldn't take it, all of that together. It's very interrupted. It's not good. I do think there's a conversation that should be had with tense and POV in this story as well. For the most part, I think the calls are made well. And that's despite it being third-person past and dual POV, which, if you've been on this podcast before, especially the Building a Story Bank episode, you'll know that is not my preference as a reader or a writer. And you'll also know that that's why I want to talk about this so much, because tense and POV, I want to experiment with more, I want to get good at these things, I want to learn more, flex the writer muscles, all of those sorts of things, and I think more people should do it. This is written in third person, and I think that's in many ways a good choice. Setting and vibes and all of that is really important in Gothic fiction, so third person is a good choice on that one. But you can also get this in first person if you use precise language. You might lose a bit, but it will certainly still be there. It's not really an issue, and you'll get more emotional depth writing in first person. And that is something that this book sorely lacks, is emotional impact of things that are meant to be impactful. And not any horror elements, anything supernatural, and I would say mystery as well, lands better in first. Am I biased to writing almost exclusively first person? Yeah, probably, but there's also a reason that I chose to write almost everything in first person. And these are those reasons. I do think one thing that's really missed in the use of third person with this is that the narrator is fairly voiceless. It's just a narrator. And given that this is horror, supposedly, and gothic fiction in particular, if you gave the narrator some amount of voicing, I mean, unreliable narrators are somewhat hated, although it's a very Marmite thing, I would think it's fair to say. But not necessarily unreliable, but someone with just a voice narrating this, I think would add a lot. I think that's just a really big missed opportunity, and I think that's just a shame. I think you can do a lot with that, especially in these genres. Especially Gothic. You can do so much with that, and it's just not done. And that's not an explicit criticism, and that's not me saying, hey, as a writer, you should have done that. It's just something that is a missed opportunity, and I think it's a shame. Tense choice in past tense I do not like, particularly, but I actually think it's a pretty good decision. It's 50-50 for me, on whether you want to go present or past. Because past tense, again, great for setting and vibes, especially in Gothic. It's a bit like fantasy in that sense. Generally, they seem to suit past tense a bit better. So I get it. But you have the problem of present working better for horror and mystery and supernatural and all of those sorts of things. So you're a bit of a rock and a hard place with this one. And I'd almost say that either first past or third present is the way to go, because then you get the best of both. You get the best vibes from either third or past tense. Like, first person you can get great vibes, but third will do better. You can call it either way. I think third past is a safe bet, and it's what a lot of writers are comfortable with. Again, I don't think this is a bad decision, but I think as a writer and someone who's just interested in literary analysis and flexing writer muscles, there were definitely options with a piece like this, and genres. Just in case in point. This was written in dual POV as a book. I think that was a good call. I think multi-POV is damn near impossible to pull off when you're trying to do a mystery, so I just wouldn't do that myself. Like, I'm sure it can be done brilliantly, but it's a risky one to do, and I think it would be really, really difficult. The single POV, I think, could suit the story well, but dual, I think, is actually just the right choice, because there's a huge romance element to that. Believe me, I'm going to get into that one later. Dual POV is great for romance. It's generally preferred for romance, I think, by writers and readers alike. I think it adds a lot to most romance stories. But there's also very much an element of that with mystery as well. You can make exactly the same argument that it adds a lot. So yeah, dual POV, good call. I might consider swapping the female main character's view to a different female character, but I think that's just trying to compensate for a bigger problem rather than actually handling it head on. Which is just the characters themselves. The characters are very flat, and they all have, their cliche period drama roles. There's not much imagination there. There is the maid of the house who's an anxious mess and doesn't really know what she's doing, and there's the estranged relative who has to come back and is angry and resentful, and the overbearing mother, though in this case an aunt, but they're all there. And it's a bit like, oh, so you tick this box and you tick that box, and if you love period drama, I really don't like it that much. If you love period drama, and I suspect this author does, you probably love that. But there's no imagination that's brought to it. If you want your character archetypes, if you want to do that, yeah, fine. That's not an issue with me in any way, shape, or form. In many cases, I actually think that's quite a good thing to do. But you need to bring something to that, or it's just, well, why don't you just watch Bridgerton instead? Why don't you just watch or read something that you know and love and is, in this case, going to be better done? There's also a huge problem with the female main character just having no clear goals or motivations at all. The obvious argument is that she's there to sort of assert her position and keep the house together, but, like, it's not really there. I think it's sort of trying to do that, but not well. It's certainly not landing, and a lot of the emotional impact, again, isn't landing, and I think that is because the characters are just so flat, that if you have really flat characters, it's nigh on impossible to carry emotional weight. It is, and this is supposedly a really emotional story around grief and family and loss and all, and just none of it lands. And it's really hard to make that land if your characters are two-dimensional at best. The side characters are little more than tissue paper, as in cardboard is too thick. It really is. There's a maid who's on page a lot, but she has zero personality beyond anxious young maid. That is her character trait, and that is it. There is nothing more there, and that's how the majority of the characters are. Even the main characters have very little more than that. To me, I suspect what happened on this one is I probably picked up a craft book. Yeah, I'm getting back on craft books, but I think they picked 3 traits for their main characters, 2 or 3, from a list, and thought, okay, well now I've got a 3-dimensional character because they've got 3 traits, so I'll just lean into those as and when I so please, and it doesn't work. Especially not when you're trying to write an emotional story around grief. No, grief is incredibly complex and a heavy burden and all of these things, and it affects people in all these ways, and if you're just going to pick a couple of traits from a list and call it good and do nothing more than that, it's just not going to work. You have to do more character development, you have to make better characters. It's a clear skill issue. There's no other way of putting it. And there's a school of thought of, oh, but if the plot's good enough, the characters can be a bit crap. I disagree with that. I do. I think the bar's been raised on that one. You don't have to choose. You can have a good plot and good characters, and you should. There's not really an excuse for bad characters anymore. And also with this book, if you're going to try and argue it's plot-driven, and that it's about plot more than it's about characters, I'm just going to tell you, well, where's the plot then? If nothing much really happens in the first half of a 300-page book, you can't claim that this is plot-driven. And now we're going to get on to another really big bugbear for me with this one. And this is the genre accuracy. I've noted this a couple of times already, but it's listed as a gothic horror. Is it gothic fiction? Well, yes, absolutely. There's no shadow of a doubt about that. It's gothic period drama, absolutely. Is it horror? No. Not even remotely. The horror elements are poorly executed. That's the long and short, is they're not well executed. They also are very infrequent. They happen at particular points, but there's not enough of it. They don't land. And it's honestly just not that horrific in really any way. It's not a horror novel. So I don't understand why it's being called horror. Horror elements, I'll give you that. But a horror? No, it is not. Is it a mystery? It leans more that way, and if it didn't have the prologue spoiling everything, I think I'd let you have that claim. But I'd call it more of a gothic romance, because that's how it's written. All the detail in terms of, physical sensation of emotion and a lot of the weight of the internal monologue and narrative is on the romance, which is particularly annoying as a horror reader. If you watch my Reads of 2024 video, yeah, I have my face cam in that one, but I'm an avid horror reader. I love horror, and I love grief horror in particular. And, I've read the blurb for this book, so it's a gothic horror, but there's a whole thread on grief. That sounds like it's right up my street. I haven't read gothic stuff before, but, it's a grief horror. It's going to be, that's my jam. And then to effectively be saddled with a gothic period drama romance with some horror elements, I feel cheated. That's not what I signed up for at all. If you're going to I get that people want to categorise their books to be more marketable, especially as someone in marketing. I get it. I do. But there is nothing worse you can do than false advertising, because you break people's trust forever. And not only do you break their trust, if anybody ever mentions you, people will say, stay the hell away. They will anti-recommend you, and that is the opposite of what you want. If this book just called itself gothic fiction with horror elements, you'll probably get more readers, in a way, because it's actually telling it how it is. You're more likely to get horror readers picking it up because it's, it's not my usual, but it's got some amount of horror in it, so I'll take a punt on something a bit different. And they're not going to hate you for mis-selling the book. I don't understand why this was marketed this way, unless the writer just does not read horror, does not engage with horror, and thinks, but there's some spooky stuff, so it's horror, which I think is a reasonable shout. The other thing is the romance. The romance is very clearly enemies to lovers, or attempting to be. But the problem with how it's done is that A, it's incredibly predictable. You see it, instantly, which is something, you've probably heard me use the word predictable a few times with this book by now, which says a fair bit. But, maybe people like predictable romance, and maybe that's the point, but when it's just playing all the hits because it can, and again, it just feels unimaginative, especially with everything else. The romance is the one part that's written the best, for sure, and there's still no imagination there. And, okay, so you can't even imagine the thing you're good at, you're best at, so, it's just not imaginative. Also, it's way too quick for enemies to lovers. They hate each other at first, although there's still a question mark over whether one of them truly hates the other, but there's some clear hatred at first, but by the 25-30% mark, you're in the tender touch, will they, won't they will phase. It's not well executed as enemies to lovers. You want that angsty slow burn with enemies to lovers. That's why people pick it up, is the angst, the slow burn, the sort of I like you but I won't admit it and I get really angry with myself. None of that is really properly there, and not for long enough. So even fans of enemies to lovers, I think, will just be frustrated by that. And there is a really weird point with the love subplot in this as well. And for this we do need to dive a little bit into the plot of the book. In backstory, the female main character and the male main character were close. Question mark about whether they were explicit lovers or whether it was we have feelings for each other but don't know what to do about it, but there's clearly some sort of history there. But that all comes crashing down when the female main character is forced to marry his dad. And he is sent away. I mean, a bit before that, I think, but they've been apart for some time. The time frame of that, by the way, is not entirely clear, because it seems to... There are points at which there's an inconsistency that appears to have been missed on that. Some places it says 16 years, and in other places it says significantly less time than that, so... Although it does seem to bonk you on the head with 16 years repeatedly, so that's what we're going to assume. But yeah, she's been married to his dad for 16 years. And then before he's even properly buried, these two are in a will they won't they. And there is a whole theme about she never loved the dad. Theoretically. However, when the dad dies, which is like the first thing that happens in the book, she's supposedly torn apart and taken ill with grief. So something there doesn't quite line up. And even so, for him, you're gonna tell me that's not gonna get in the way and it'll be brushed under the carpet at all, for starters, but that quickly? You expect me to buy that? That's unrealistic at best, and just really creepy and weird at worst. You could argue the case for making a bit more sense in historical time periods, but like, this isn't historical faction. That's not the point, that this is something that really happened and is sort of being fictionalized. So it's just weird. I feel like, especially in today's climate, it's just a really odd thing to do and to write and make sexy. The last point I want to make, and this is a bit of a nitpick on my part, but I think it's also poor line editing, is the precision of the prose. Now, don't get me wrong, the prose in this book, for the most part, is beautifully written. It is, it's absolutely beautifully done, for the most part. However, historical settings do require especially precise prose. If you ask me, some of the most difficult prose to write is in historical settings, because you have to be careful with language. Like, really, really careful in ways you don't have to otherwise. And that precision of language just isn't always there. There are a couple of points that just use language that is too modern, and it breaks immersion completely. Again, that's just sort of craft skill issues and poor editing as well. But the bigger issue is also just repeated words as well. It's not terrible for it overall, but you do get phrases. This isn't a direct quote, but you do get phrases to the effect of, carrying her exhausted him, and he was just exhausted. And I really wish I was joking, but some of the prose is literally like that, with word choices. And that's, in a first draft, that's one thing. We all do that in our first drafts at times, and we just can't remember the damn word, it's 11:30, we just want to finish this paragraph before we go to bed. So we'll just use that word and tell ourselves to edit it later. But this is not a first draft, this is a published piece of work. That is just poor. I mean, I handwrite, and then I type things up. So stuff like that gets caught straight away. If you type your drafts, as most people do, I think it's easier to miss those things, but I think there is a very strong argument for leaving yourself a comment as you type, or putting some punctuation, changing the colour of the text, bolding it, doing something, if you know you have a tendency to miss these things. And if you're in the flow of things, I get that sometimes it's going to be missed, but you should be reading your work more carefully than that before you publish it. We're all going to miss things, but that is a really bad mistake to make, especially more than once. The other one I have a real bugbear with, and this is a bit of a pet peeve, I'll admit, is the dialogue tag usage. I'm not a huge fan of dialogue tags, I've never made a secret of that, especially if they're really basic and don't have modifiers put with them. So asked sheepishly or stuff like that. If it's just she asked, he said, she asked, he replied, that's poor writing. And that is how a shocking amount of the conversations in this book go. You can easily alleviate stuff like this with body language, or action tags, or just cutting the dialogue tag completely, especially with something like she asked. There's already a question mark within the dialogue. It's so rare for the dialogue tag asked to be necessary. It's so rare. And that, again, it's first draft, whatever. I like my first draft to be tidy, I've put serious work into that, I've talked about that on this podcast before. I know that a lot of people go very far the other way and just, as they often call it, vomit draft it, and just get anything on the page because you can edit a full page. And I don't have any issue with that, so long as you actually edit it. This just hasn't been done. And something like dialogue tags, you really should be watching it. Again, especially if you know you have tendencies to do these things. And I do think a lot of the issues with this book, flat characters, editing issues, I think a lot of this does stem from being a relatively new writer. At least I should certainly hope it does. Because I don't see otherwise how that could have gone unchecked for quite so long. The one thing I am really surprised by is the lack of editing quality, especially given that this has been through professional edits. I know for a fact this book went through professional edits, and these issues are still here. Again, I'm not saying everything should be perfect. I don't expect perfection. People will miss things. Especially when it's a skeleton crew working on it. I get it. But when it's repeated issues that are rookie mistakes, and when it's just really odd choices, like interrupting conversations for pages-long flashbacks, I don't see really how a professional editor can let that slide. I don't think the author did write the book this way, so you can argue that all the blame is with the author, and perhaps the author was a nightmare to work with in edits, and some things had to be let slide, but if I was the publisher, I would not want my name on this. And I would say, look, if you don't improve this, we're just going to have to pull it. And perhaps that's draconian of me, but it's not only made me question whether I'd ever read the author again, the answer is just no, frankly, but it makes me question the publishing house as well. So I hope that this has been an interesting episode. I think literary analysis is an interesting thing, and I imagine that the people who listen to this podcast share in that view. Or if you're new here, then hell, the idea of literary analysis on a podcast is probably something you've been dying for. It's pretty rare to get these days, outside of query letters. That's another reason I wanted to do this. And if you are a fellow writer and you're struggling to get published, I hope this is some sort of motivation for you and think, well, this got published and it's full of really bad problems, so I can do better. Another reason I wanted to do this episode was just that I spent so long listening to this book, and yes, I was doing other things while listening to it, but I wished I'd be listening to something better, something that was more worth my time. I do feel like I wasted time on this book, and eventually I just wanted to get something worthwhile out of it. I wanted to get some proper stimulation. I feel like I've learned things. I feel like I've done interesting analysis and interesting thought exercise, and alleviated a lot of my frustration. So it may have been a DNF, but all's well that ends well. If you have written a book that you are proud of, and it is published, or well on the way, please do get in touch. Indie and self-pub writers, you are the people I want to hear from the most. My email is on screen. Please include the information that is in the description. That makes my life a lot easier. And I'll do my best to get back to you when I can. I'm not particularly well at the minute, so don't expect the quickest response ever, but I'll do my best. And if you're looking to find me elsewhere, I am just about anywhere and everywhere doing various things in different places. I'm Jade Black 21 or Jade_Black, depending on the platform, but they've all got the same profile picture, so you'll know it's me. And also just the pretentious energy radiating off of them as well. That generally helps. So I'm here on YouTube. You can drop a sub if you don't want to miss any episodes of the podcast where I do weird and wacky and who knows what at any given time. I don't know half the time. Or any future episodes of tips from a DNF, because I don't plan on just doing the one episode. I don't plan on DNFing tons of books. Hopefully it'll be a while until the next one on that front, but I do think there's interesting learning to be had from things like this. And if you agree and you don't want to miss it, dropping a sub is genuinely the best way to make sure you don't. You can also find me on Instagram, which is somewhat of the podcast home. It's also a place to find good indie books. There's also Twitter if you want to be up to date on my writing and what sort of writing shenaniganery I'm getting up to on there. I do semi-live updates on Twitter. I also host the monthly Thrills prompts. Pinterest is a place where you can find all my art stuff and curated image feeds of what the places I write about kind of sort of look like, which is pretty neat. And I'm also on Blue Sky once in a blue moon to talk about game dev, but I don't have all that much time for that at the minute, but I am there, so you can always drop me a line on there. And I think that is about all for now. So until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, or commenting, or subscribing. It really does help the channel a lot. All music is done by me. Copyright Jade Black 2025.